I recently picked up a beautiful example of what low-end Mac calls the worst Macintosh of all time, the Performa 6200 CD. Now, is it really as bad as people make it out to be? I mean, just look at how well it plays intensive 3D games. So let's take a look at this, take it apart, pop in a few upgrades, and find out. The Performa 6200 series was released in May of 1995 during the dark days of Apple, where multiple product lines converged and overlapped and competed with one another. The Performa line was generally targeted to home users and came bundled with a monitor, mouse, keyboard, and software for those who didn't want to have to pick all that junk out separately. My Performa here is an early 6200 CD, which came with a 75 megahertz PowerPC 603 processor. And of course, later variations of this series had a 603E, which is better. The original one had 8 megs of RAM, but fortunately, the previous owner upgraded this to 40 megs of RAM. But that's still horrible, so we'll be maxing that out at 64 megs. And it had a 4-speed CD-ROM drive and originally came with a 1 gig hard drive, although that's also been updated by the previous owner. This originally came with a 15-inch Apple Color monitor, but the previous owner included this very awesome and very nicely matching NEC LCD monitor that he'd been using with the machine. So there's a few things I'd like to do with this today. Of course, max out the RAM at 64 megs, but I also want to try to remove this branding from the monitor because I don't need a big billboard for NEC multi-sync LCD 1525V shouting into my face every time I play with this. So let's take this thing apart, and while we do those things, we'll talk a little bit about this computer's history and why it's such a controversial little desktop Mac. So one thing I really love about these old Macs is their construction. And of course, there are some YouTubers out there who I happen to like a lot who really don't like the construction of this computer at all. But I think Apple, even in their dark days, spent a lot of time thinking about ease and good design, especially when it comes to upgrading your computer. You didn't have to tear the whole computer apart to get into the motherboard. Instead, it's 2 screws, and they even put a nice little handle here, and you just slide the whole thing out, which is very reminiscent even of Mac computers into the late 90s and early 2000s when everyone raves about how well they were designed and how clever they were to take apart. Look, this 6200, very clever to take apart. So here we have the very convenient motherboard of our Performa 6200, and we can see some of the cards that the previous owner put in here, including the Apple video system here, which gives us the video inputs, an S-video input here, and also an upgraded Ethernet card. And then here is our RAM that we'll be replacing. But before we do, I just thought it was very cute that the seller of the new memory includes a note with the order saying that he'd like pictures of the computer that you are restoring. So I figure I actually will do that. I'll email him a picture of this Performa because it is quite nice. So let's pop this memory out. And we have our new memory right here. And now I'll just slide this right back in here. Push it in so it's connected, lift up this nice little latch and snap it back in place. So the Performa 6200 series, along with the 5200 and 6300 series of machines, they're collectively called the worst Macintosh hardware of all time by Low End Mac, which is a site that I've loved and trusted for more than 20 years. And they call out a few things specifically, including that these machines were parts bin specials thrown together with leftover parts from 68K machines, and that they're essentially a Quadra 630 with a PowerPC processor haphazardly hacked into it. The serial ports don't support hardware handshaking, allegedly, leading to speed issues that don't really matter today, honestly. Most importantly, though, memory. And not just that low limit of 64 megs of RAM, which was fairly reasonable back in the day, but rather that the data path from the memory is 32 bits, which is left over from the 68K days, but the processor in here is 64-bit. And that can lead to all sorts of alleged problems. And the big allegation is that instead of the processor being able to just read from the memory in one cycle, because of that 32-bit data path, the processor takes 4 cycles to load one instruction from memory. Now, the accuracy of this is hotly debated, and in fact, there is an article out there by an engineer which counters nearly every point of that low-end Mac article and specifically shows how the 4-cycle memory issue is simply not true. All I know, though, is that I do love this quirky little computer, and I'll link to both sides of the debate down below in case you'd like to read more about it. And we can see the Magic Eraser is actually doing a pretty good job of removing the branding. This is already quite diminished when you compare it to the screen printing that I haven't started on yet. So I'm going to keep plugging away and see if I can't get this huge obtrusive NEC logo all the way off. Now, I picked up this machine from a fellow member of the Vintage Macintosh Restoration and Preservation Group on a certain blue social media site that won't be named, who used it as his bridge machine between modern and vintage computers. And according to him, it's had several exciting adventures, including network booting in Apple II GS. It has bridged to Macintosh Plus so it could connect to a file share on a Raspberry Pi, which is very cool. It helped an old PowerBook print to an Ethernet-enabled laser printer. He played a game of Lode Runner with a G4 Cube. This acted as a video display for an Apple IIc, thanks to the RCA input, which is also how I connected that Nintendo 64. This acted as a display for his NES, thanks to that coax video input in the back. And he's built boot floppies to rescue various old computers. There we go. I'd say that was a pretty successful branding delete with just a Magic Eraser and about 45 minutes. All right, so we are booted into macOS 8.6, and it honestly does not feel any faster, but let's check our memory. All right, we've got our 64 megs of RAM. So, sweet. Totally tricked out Performa 6200 CD. Let's see if we can get to the shared folder on my PowerBook G4. Which I believe is at 10.00.17. All right. So pretty awesome how easy it is to network extremely old and just a little bit old Macintoshes together. Could play some Doom 2 over the network. But if you enjoyed this video, I'd appreciate a thumbs up. And as always, if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe down below because there will be many more to come. And thank you all for watching.